Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are joining us from in the world. And welcome to this high level conversation between the Managing Director of the IMF, Madame Kristalina, as well as the Director General of the International Labour Organization, Mr. Guy Ryder. My name is Nozipho Shabalala, and it is an absolute privilege to serve you as the moderator of this conversation today. Our two speakers are going to be leaning into the question of looking at the recent developments in the informal economy. Now, we're also using this moment and this high-level conversation to bring light to the recently launched IMF book, which is titled Global Informal Workforce, Priorities for Inclusive Growth. And so we really are going to be looking into some of the insights and recommendations coming from the book. And if you are looking for a copy of the book, please make sure just to visit our event webpage. You see the image of the book on your screen right now, and that is, of course, imf.org/informal economy, and you would be directed to a downloadable copy there. Now, I do want to extend a special welcome to all of you, our global audience, and I also want to say, if you want to help us to amplify this conversation onto social media, the hashtag that we are using is informal economy. Now, just before we get into the conversation, it is important for us to pause on the context of the conversation. As we are talking, 60% of the adult labor workforce is in the informal economy, and we're talking about close to 2 billion workers. If we bring in the lens of COVID-19, we also see a disproportionate negative impact on the informal economy, especially in the developing markets, where large segments of the population are not covered by any social protection schemes. And so today we're going to be really trying to get out of this conversation in line with what we see in the book, lifting some of the key challenges in the informal economy. We're going to try and surface some of the best practice models and policies that we could be replicating more broadly. We are going to look at some of those practical policy responses and recommendations. And of course, we are going to take advantage of the fact that we can have a conversation about how the ILO and the IMF can further complement their work of policy design and implementation together. And so let's get right into it. I'm going to start off with Madame Georgieva and bring this question to you. And I want to make sure, Madame, that we are all speaking from the same hymn sheet. And that is, what is the informal economy? More importantly, why does it matter now? Why is it so important to be having this conversation today?
I am so thrilled to be with Guy Ryder and with you, Nozipho, today. It is a very important topic, and you pinned down why it affects 60% of people in employment. It matters to so many, so much. So let's start from what is the informal economy. This is the space of activities that have market value but are not registered, either because it is a street vendor that has never entered the formal economy, or because it is a firm in the formal economy but trying to save on taxes to hide some of its activities, some of its workers. So there is a big space where informality exists. Let me say three things that are important for the start of our conversation. One, we should not make the informal economy the boogeyman of the economy. We should not be negative about it, because it is a safety net for so many people. They're there in their vast majority, not by choice, but because they cannot enter the formal economy. Two, this being said, we do want to see move from informality to formality. Why? because being in the formal economy is better for workers. They get better pay, they get better social protection. And we know it is mostly vulnerable people that are in the informal economy. Uh, but it is also good for the health of the economy as a whole. When there is more formality, there is higher productivity, the country is likely to reach its full potential. And when there is higher formality, there are more taxes flowing in the budget, so there can be more investments in education, in health, as we see now in this pandemic, in roads, in the infrastructure that makes life for everybody easier. And my third point is that we do have policies in place that can help us move from informal to formal economy. And this is what this book that you have shown, and I just want to show it again to our viewers. This is what the book is all about. How can we gradually move more of the economy from informality to formality? And I am sure Guy would have a lot to add to what the book is recommending as well.
Thank you very much, MD, for kicking us off. And you make some salient points here. The first and foremost is that let's not treat the informal economy like the boogeyman of the economy. Certainly, I'm sure this is something that's a soundbite that many are going to be leaning into in this conversation. You talk, of course, about the transition from informality to formality and how the book is an opportunity for us to look at some of the policy recommendations to do that. I do want to say to our global audience, we do want to hear your voice in this conversation. So if you'd like to ask a question or comment, please send me an email. My email is informaleconomy@imf.org, informaleconomy@imf.org, and I'm going to try and bring your voice into the conversation. If you have it on your screen right now. But DG, let me come to you, and I want to make sure that we are all having the same conversation. So the same question to you, DG. What is the informal economy on your view, and why does it matter so much right now?
Well, thanks, Nozi. And let me say we are having the same conversation. Having listened to Kristalina, I'm delighted to be a party to this conversation. And if through it we can serve to advance our joint work, the IMF and the ILO, and mobilize, I think, opinion to combat the issues that come out of the informal economy, we'll be doing something very important. Let me say the first thing. I do agree that we should not regard the informal economy and the people engaged in making a livelihood in the informal economy, which is a majority of the world's populations, as being villains, as being the bad people in this film. But they are, in a sense, victims, because the informal economy is associated with substandard forms of work, with poverty situations, with companies which necessarily remain at low levels of productivity. The informal economy, to revert to the title of the IMF's excellent publication, is, if you like, the antithesis of inclusive growth. How can we imagine inclusive global growth when over 6 out of 10 people and 8 out of 10 of the world's enterprises are in the informal economy? It doesn't work that way. Now, because the informal economy is so very, very varied, it's very heterogeneous. You find it in the urban setting. You see it in the omnipresent street vendors. You'll find it overwhelmingly in the rural economy of the developing world, with family enterprises, but you find it also in the developed economies as well. Think of this. In some of the least developed countries, 90% of people can be in the informal economy. In the highest income countries, that figure's up around 18% as well. So we should not have any too simplistic idea about what the informal economy actually looks like and what it is. We, in our definition, and it appears in an instrument that the ILO adopted back in 2015 on the transition from the informal to the formal economy, which should be our joint ambition and our joint objective. Well, we describe the informal economy as being defined by the absence of the effective application of formal arrangements, be it legislation, be it institutions of the labour market or other parts of society. What does that mean in practice? It means situations where segments of the economy are excluded from formal regulation. I think of domestic employees or some small enterprises, situations in which the law should apply, but there is no compliance, or situations where the law is simply inadequate. So it's a very, very varied phenomenon. Now, the question is, why does it exist and what do we really need to do to get away from it? Well, I agree 100% with Kristalina. People, by and large, don't choose to be the informal economy. There may be those seeking to evade their tax or social security responsibilities, but most people are stuck in the informal economy, not because they want to be there, but they can't find a way out. So I think that we need to find ways to bring down barriers to formalization, stimulate the formal economy so it's able to absorb more people, create more decent jobs. And also, as we're making this transformation happen, and this won't happen overnight, we shouldn't treat the informal economy as something we need to eliminate. Many people depend upon it. We need to be attentive to their well-being and to their livelihoods and move forward in an integrated way, in a way which takes account of the interests of people in all of these very varied situations.
Aditya, what you've done excellently is just to surface for us the complexity of the informal economy as you touch on the invitation for us to not reduce this conversation to a tax evasion conversation, to not reduce this conversation with the assumption that we're talking about a homogeneous economy, but also that even as we transition, it is done within context and gradually. So maybe, Madame Georgieva, let me come back to you. I want to bring COVID-19 and the global pandemic into the conversations. What steps have governments taken to support informal workers during the pandemic that we should be looking to?
The good news is that what the pandemic has done is to bring more attention to people that are excluded from ways in which help can be provided in a society. And that has led to remarkable increase of outreach to informal workers. We have seen at the IMF a large number, 140 countries, taking steps and putting in place measures or expanding existing measures to provide support to people that are in the informal economy. And what is so impressive is that one of the big news of the pandemic was and is accelerated digitalization, that this has been put to service for people that otherwise would have found themselves in desperate situations. So let me give you 3 examples. One, we have seen countries where there are existing social safety nets based on digital services to use data to identify where there may be people that need help, but are not yet getting it, and then expanding through mobile phone services primarily the delivery of that kind of support. We have seen countries introducing new measures. I was very impressed by what Togo has done. They introduced a new mobile money. This is cashless transfer program called Novisi, and that program targets adult workers in the informal economy. And I think we will see it after the pandemic being still used to expand social protection. And then we have seen the simplification of delivery of support in Peru, in Kenya. The fact that you can do something with digital to help people being deployed on a scale in so many places is really, really encouraging. Simplified mobile banking system, use of text messages, things that we have seen are absolutely paramount. Now, let me make one point, though, that we have to all be reflective of. It doesn't mean that we don't have people who have remained excluded from this support. And this is why I want to land on the main message of our book. And it is sustainable and inclusive development requires gradual move towards the formal economy for people that are now outside of it. So I don't want to leave it with the impression that, oh, well, we found ways to help people in the informal economy, therefore, let's not worry about informality. We should worry about informality. It makes societies less productive. It leaves people with worse conditions of work and lower wages. That has to go, and in our analysis, we have identified 4 very important avenues to address that. And I hope you would give me 1 minute to just list them, and I'm interested in Guy's reaction to what we say. The first,
Go ahead.
The first is actually education and skills. Prepare boys and girls to be able to enter the formal economy, either as entrepreneurs, start their own businesses, or as workers in formal production units. And I cannot stress enough how important skills are today and for the future. Second, streamline all the tax systems and business running systems, because very often small firms stay out because it's so complicated to register, to pay your taxes. Taxes are too high. So create the incentives by simply focusing on good business environment for entering the formal economy. 3, financial inclusion. The more we can do to create opportunities for everybody to be included, the more likely it is we would have a better a chance for formal economy. And last but not least, there are a number of very important structural policies like labor market reforms, eliminating administrative barriers, fighting corruption. When there is high level of corruption, many citizens and firms say, I don't want to pay taxes. My taxes are just going to go into a big black hole. So the story is complicated. It is not one thing. There is no silver bullet. But if we act on all these 4 parts, we will accelerate the move to the formal economy, and we make society fairer, more inclusive, and more productive.
MD, well, you've put the baton to DG Ryder by saying, we'd love to get his reaction. And in that response, you've already touched on some of the IMF's main policy recommendations for that gradual transition and looking for the opportunity, of course, to accelerate it. So, DG Ryder, I'm going to come to you. The invitation is your reaction to the 4 proposals: education and skills, streamlining our tax systems and making it simpler for smaller businesses to engage in the tax system, financial inclusion, but also looking at structural policies that really make it even easier to accelerate away from informality to formality. Your reaction to that, DG, and then if there's anything that you'd like to add in terms of the ILO's policy recommendations for this transition.
Yeah, let me get to Kristalina's four proposals. They resonate very strongly with everything that the ILO has been saying for a number of years, and which figure in this recommendation we adopted in 2015 on the transition from informality to formality. But can I just start where Kristalina started, saying what is wrong, what is bad about the informal economy? Well, when we adopted our recommendation in 2015, we developed a very interesting consensus across our three parties, governments, workers, and employers. They all agreed, and this wasn't always the case, by the way, that formalizing the informal economy is the right thing to do. Why? For governments, because the informal economy escapes their coverage. It reduces their tax take. It reduces their capacity to govern the economy as they would wish. For workers, well, the informal economy, regrettably, is associated almost universally with substandard employment quality. I'll just give you a couple of figures. For every dollar earned by a wage earner in the formal economy, a wage earner in the informal economy doing a similar job would get 66 cents. A woman would get less than that, 43 cents. And if you go to the self-employed, which make up just a little bit less than half of the informal economy, that gap is greater. For own account workers, greater still. And for enterprises, well, a formal enterprise quite rightly sees an informal competitor as unfair competition. And for the informal enterprises themselves, the problem is lack of access to finance, to all of the facilities that the state can offer to promote their activities. So I'll turn to Kristalina's four proposals. Yes, education and skills is fundamentally important. We know that educational attainment in the informal economy is much lower than the educational status of formal workers. The simplification of regulatory processes, the streamlining, I think was the word that Kristalina used, this is mightily important. We need to really cut out unnecessary red tape. We have to make sure that the entry barriers or the barriers to entry to the formal economy are not so formidable that the informal enterprises can't get across them. We need a lot of help from the institutions of the state to help companies to make that transition. And yes, we need to look at the formal economy to make sure to do our best to ensure that the formal economy is able to absorb those who are currently or in the future would otherwise be employed in the informal economy. And yes, that can mean labour market reform and structural changes. But of course, these are complex processes, and we have to work out very, very carefully what the terms are of those types of structural changes and reforms. And may I just add a couple of further points? And at a time when growing inequality in the world is something which bothers us greatly and has been cruelly exposed during the pandemic, the size of an informal economy is very, very closely correlated with levels of inequality and inclusivity in our society. So by tackling the informal economy in all the ways that are being suggested, and there are others too, which I could refer to, we're also making our societies in the broadest sense more equitable, fairer, and more stable in the last instance. Thanks.
Gigi, thank you very much. And, so we've had a response to the MD's 4 proposals, but also you're speaking about the broader benefit for society and people more broadly as we move towards more equitable and inclusive societies. Now, one of the promises that I have made to our audience is that I'm going to give them a share of voice in this conversation. So I want to bring some of our audience voices in. MD Georgieva, I'm going to come to you with this question from Aeneas Vrimbanovsky from Brazil. And Aeneas is saying, are there any innovative financing measures for social protection that we could consider for the informal sector, especially given the fiscal pressures that are experienced by developing countries? So, are there innovative ways of financing social protection for the informal economy, given the fiscal pressures that already are there in developing markets? Your thoughts, please, MD.
The evidence is clear that in quite a number of countries, the fact that governments asked people to stop producing and stop consuming, whether they are in the formal or the informal economy, meant an obligation for governments to offer a helping hand to everybody, to businesses and to households. And at the IMF, from the very beginning of this crisis, we have encouraged governments to please use the capacity you have to the fullest to help your people, to help your economy. And that has been done, as I mentioned in my previous response, including for the informal sector. We have seen across the board, especially in the parts of the world with very high informality. And by the way, if you look at the distribution of informality, Latin America is high, so is Sub-Saharan Africa, much more so than Europe or Asia. And in these places, governments, for fairness to them, they have gone out of their way, especially using digital technology, encouraging people to step forward. And that, I hope, would mean post-pandemic better social protection, because people that were not registered in any systems are now registered. But you're asking a very important question. How much can be done, especially in countries with limited fiscal space? And the answer is we, in this crisis, have seen institutions like mine, the IMF, stepping up to help countries have more fiscal space for this crisis like no other. Just for example, in Latin America, we have gone out of our way to provide emergency financing. We did the same for Sub-Saharan Africa, and also to provide financing through our normal channels. So did the development banks. And one thing that I'm very pleased to share with the audience, the IMF members have taken a very unusual step to create fiscal space for the world by issuing $650 billion new allocation of our reserve asset called special drawing rights. So as we have carry out this discussion, our members are actually voting on the allocation. I hope it would be in place by the end of August. A way in which we contribute to boosting reserves and creating more space for the priority actions, among them helping the part of the economy that in Latin America is quite significant, that is informal and therefore at risk not to be helped. And let me just add one more point. I don't want to pretend that everywhere everything was done perfectly. We are providing just-in-time advice to our members to compare notes with others. What are the measures that have been taken, especially using digital technologies, to reach out to informal workers, to make sure that where this is not yet being done on the required scale, they can be learning from experience of others. And we are also pressing for more progressivity in taxation. Those in society that can pay more in taxes in this crisis and after this crisis, they ought to do so.
Thank you very much, MD, and of course, encouraging news on the front of the creation of fiscal space and the invitation to compare notes, to really have a conversation about what's working, and of course, the call to action in terms of progressive tax systems. DG, I want to come back to you. There's a question for us from Samrian Afoju from Ghana, and Samrian, DG, is asking, has the ILO come up with any policy guidelines around informal sector pensions for developing countries? DG?
Yeah, thanks very much. Well, yes, we have. We've just had a major discussion on social protection in a more general way at our conference, and we have issued guidance on the extension of social protection to the informal economy, and that does include the issue of pensions. it's not a new issue. Of course, it has come very much to the surface, hasn't it, during the COVID-19 pandemic? But we have been working, including with the IMF, I want to say, on putting in place social protection floors around the world, particularly in developing countries, in a way which can indeed improve the security of people working in the informal economy. And I've had experience of some very positive examples of this. Mozambique was one great example going back a few years, where the IMF worked hard on identifying available fiscal space, and the ILO was able to come with some of the techniques of social protection which could be applied in those circumstances. So the answer to the precise question from Ghana is we're absolutely working in these areas, and we can make available our findings so far. But if I could benefit from the opportunity also to respond to what the Managing Director has said, and things we're already doing together. I mean, the ILO and the IMF are very much in dialogue on many things, and that includes the informal economy. We're working in the IMF working group on the informal economy. The IMF is also helping us. We're trying to work on the conceptual statistics. It's difficult to measure the informal economy, and I think having clarity of concept and measurement is a great start when you're trying to build the right types of policies to address the informal economy. I hope as well that from these beginnings we can work our way down to where it really matters, which is at the national level. The ILO is active in about 50 of our member states, trying to promote this transition from informality to the formal economy. And many of our member states have really brought into this agenda as a national policy priority. And it's really great to hear what Kristalina has been saying about the IMF's promotion of fiscal space, the SDR issuance, and all the rest of it. I think we really do have to combine our efforts and our complementarities, they're natural complementarities, to try to move this agenda forward. It applies in respect of social protection. It applies also in many other aspects of the way that we have to promote this transition process.
Didier, I think it's an excellent response, and one I must say is a response to a question I have every intention of asking, but I think the excitement for all of us in this conversation, when we listen to the complementarity coming through in the conversation, the alignment that is coming through in how we might tackle this transition from informality to formality, is certainly something that is a positive thread in this conversation. So with your permission, allow me to throw the exact same question that you've just raised for us back to the Managing Director and say, from your view, Madam, the opportunities for the IMF and the ILO to continue to work together as we look at this transition. What are your views on that?
Let me go back a bit in history. When this collaboration deepened, it was in 2019 when the IMF came up with a strategy on social spending and that was my predecessor, Christine Lagarde, chose ILO as the place to launch this strategy. And I think it was a very wise choice. It created excitement for collaboration. Many on this call would remember days when the IMF was severely criticized for not paying enough attention of the needs of the poor and vulnerable, of the importance of education, healthcare, social protection. That really has changed with the not only with the strategy, but with the way the strategy is now being implemented. We have 11 pilot cases with ILO where we work specifically on ways in which ILO's skills in social protection, pensions, labor market can be applied. And for those on the call, I want to list the countries. So if you are from one of these countries and you don't think that we are collaborating enough with ILO in your country, do let me know. So we have Mozambique, Cambodia, and Egypt on social protection issues, Bangladesh and Iraq on pensions, and Namibia, Jordan, and Samoa on labor market simplification and reforms. And I want to say one more word on collaboration with ILO, and it is on gender equality. This crisis has hit low-skilled workers, young people, and women the hardest. And it makes it even more important for us to work together to prevent a reversal in what has been good progress on gender equality. And there, with ILO and with other UN agencies like UN Women, what we want to see is gender-based budgeting. We want to see lifting up the issues of women, including women in the informal economy. Uh, there are more men in the informal economy just because there are more men in the labor market overall. But if you take the share of women in proportion to men, there are actually, relatively speaking, more women that have been pushed out of their jobs because of the pandemic. And therefore, we do have to pay attention to it. And of course, an old issue, which is equal pay. It is in the formal economy. Women are not paid equally to men. It is in the informal economy as well. And I'll tell you a small anecdote, personal story. The very first time I was employed and paid was in my home country, Bulgaria. In the informal economy, my brother and I got paid to help in a local market. Guess what? He got more than I did. And at that time, I said, well, he's my older brother. But with time, I learned he was paid more because he was the boy and I was the girl. So I cannot emphasize enough how important it is that we don't lose sight of that issue of gender equality.
MD, it's such an excellent story and an anecdote as you bring the gendered effect of the pandemic into the conversation. DG, I'm sure you have a story of your own or a response to what the MD has shared. I'd love to hear from you, but also if you can take on this question on productivity. It's a question that comes from Amadou Suku. And Amadou is actually part of the ILO's employers constituency in Geneva. And Amadou is asking, how can productivity help us address informality? How can productivity help us address informality, DG?
Thanks, Nosy. I'll get to productivity. I haven't got as good a story as Kristalina to tell about the informal sector, but she does make a couple of points I just need to make a very quick comment about. Firstly, that coming together with the IMF in 2019 was really important. When Kristalina's predecessor came to our conference, it was our centenary conference. We were thinking about the future of work at that time, and this whole new IMF direction on social spending led to the opening of avenues of cooperation, which are really, really important to us. And I think, well, COVID got a bit in the way of all of this, but in the light of the recovery process that we're now trying to get moving, I think it's really time to come back and to consolidate and build upon those great beginnings. We're very enthusiastic about that. Gender is massively important in this story. Yes, women are overrepresented in the informal economy. Yes, women have been more than proportionately hit, damaged by this COVID-19 pandemic. The IMF has a very honourable record. It elects women to leadership positions better than the ILO does, as you can see. And these are things that we have to move forward upon. Productivity, very important. I see productivities and low productivity as being both a cause of informality and a consequence of informality. We know that the levels of productivity in the informal economy are extremely low when compared to enterprises which are comparable in the informal economy. And at the same time, low productivity economies tend to generate more informality because the entry costs to the formal economy are simply too high for companies to meet. So we have an agenda at the ILO of helping to promote higher productivity, to promote successful, sustainable enterprises. And this is one more essential strand of the overall process of transition to the formal economy. So I absolutely get the point on productivity, and we need to factor that into all of our efforts.
Thank you for bringing in that response, DG, because as you were saying, it is a complex situation. So we have to look at it from multiple lenses, and the lens of productivity is certainly a very interesting one. I want us to go to Zimbabwe now with you, MD. We have a question from Kudakwashe Migo, and Kudakwashe is really going back to the point you made earlier around, the dual existence of informality and formality, and that we need to in context, ensure that we are gradually transitioning towards formality. And Kudakwasha is asking, whilst we're doing that, in what ways can we ensure that there is a coexistence, if necessary, between the informal economy and the formal economy? And Kudakwasha goes back to the point you made to say the informal economy is not the boogeyman, and talks about how through VAT, as an example, does contribute to the national tax pocket. Your thoughts on that comment, MD? Is there an opportunity for us to look at coexistence whilst we are transitioning?
We ought to look at coexistence because there is simply no way to transit from informality to formality in one big leap. It will take time. And in meanwhile, so many people depend on their employment as street vendors or as workers in small non-registered firms for their very existence, for this informal job to be there. What we do have to recognize, though, is that the road to travel has to be towards formality. And therefore, the policies that are in place, they have to highlight how this road is going to be traveled. And then in the process, and that is probably the most important contribution I can make in answering this question, is to seek ways in which informal workers and firms can gradually become more integrated. And the message that we have conveyed during this crisis of providing social assistance, cash transfers to everybody in need, those that are in the formal and those that are in the informal economy, and using this process to register people and firms, so to take that gradual road towards formalization. That, to my mind, is the best that we can do. And as we move forward, always look for examples that can excite you to do more in that direction from other countries. We know that Latin America has reduced informality quite significantly. From the data, it looks like over the last 20 years, it has gone down quite a lot. How did they do it? What is the benefit? We know that in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, around Zimbabwe, there are countries that do much better than others. How do they do it? How can we get more benefits for society by learning from each other and doing this learning as fast as we can?
MD, thank you very much. How do we learn from each other and share that learning and learn as fast as we can? We have so many questions and so little time. I'm going to try my best to squeeze in one question to the DG and the MD, just to bring in these really interesting angles, and then we'll begin to wrap up. DG, there's a question that's come in, and it says, considering the nature or the changing nature of work, where we're seeing the idea of regular wages decreasing, the idea of traditional employment becoming obsolete, and more workers are becoming service providers, is this a risk that could increase informality? Your thoughts, please, DG.
The answer is yes, there is a risk there. We are seeing in what we might call the modern economy a diversification, some call them non-standard employment forms, facilitated by digitalization in many cases. And, events are running ahead of our capacity to react to these new forms of work. So there is, I think, a genuine danger, and it's not just a danger because it's happening in some instances, that this quick evolution under the push, if you like, of digital technologies can create regulatory vacuums. And what happens when you get a vacuum? When informality rushes in and fills up that space. And I would say something similar to the very important points that Kristalina has made in respect of this cohabitation of formal and informal, and I agree very much with that. But we have to make sure that this interaction of formal and informal enterprises is such that we respect what Kristalina called the direction of travel towards formalization. Because there's a danger, of course, that informality becomes established in informal enterprises and formal sectors of the economy and moves us in the opposite direction. And with all of this, I just want to make one point, if you'll allow it, Nosin. I know time is short now. We haven't mentioned it, and we really have to mention it. You know, informal economy is not an anonymous mass. There are people there, and they have representatives, and we have to find ways of listening to the people, be they employers, be they workers in the informal economy, listen carefully, learn from their experience, and take into account what they have to tell us about their circumstances and where they want to go in the future.
Absolutely, DG. And again, bringing in the importance of social dialogue. The MD, I'm squeezing this in, although I'm getting instructions to wrap up. There is a PhD student from the University of Montreal, a PhD in economics, Idosu Adon. And Idosu is saying, MD, is there a correlation between poor access to finance and informality? And if there is, what could we do to increase access to finance, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises, so that we might begin to reduce informality? A quick thought on that, MD.
Great we have PhD students on the call. You're going to give the answers to all the questions that are being asked in your work. And the answer to your question, yes, there is correlation. And this is why one of the 4 areas of action we recommend in our report is advancing financial inclusion. We know that the world has made progress on financial inclusion, but not at all enough to bring people into the economy in an effective way so they can contribute to society. Very often we talk about inclusion as if this is charity. Oh, we're doing it for you. No, we're doing it for us. Because when we increase financial inclusion, that means more people would have access to finance to become entrepreneurs, to build their businesses. You're right to ask, are SMEs getting the short end of the stick? Yes, they are. In this crisis, a lot has been done, specifically targeting small and medium-sized enterprises in terms of access to finance. But still, if you look at the numbers, it is the larger companies that have benefited more from the generous support from governments. How can we move on that? Obviously, by using the power of digitalization. And that takes me to a point I want to land on, which is we are going to not resolve any of the problems we are discussing today unless there is equal access to the internet, equal access to digital services for everyone, everywhere. The same way financial inclusion is leaving Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Latin America, parts of Southeast Asia out. We see digitalization and access to the internet leaving parts of the very same places out. So these are problems that can be only addressed together. The IMF has been doing a lot on financial inclusion. We have the so-called Bali agenda together with the World Bank. It is all about massively increasing access to financial services for everyone, everywhere, especially for women. And we will continue to press on that front as well as on access to the internet. As long as in Sub-Saharan Africa, 50% of people, businesses, and government services are not connected to the internet, we are not going to make enough progress. We are actually going to do the opposite, further deepen the divergence in our world between the haves and the have-nots.
Yeah.
With the same token, Nozi, if we unlock that access, we can see leapfrogging of our generation and a much, much more inclusive and fair world.
So I'm in a lot of trouble now because I know that my time is up and I've probably gone over by a minute. But I am going to ask for a final word, and I'm going to ask for a soundbite. And I'd love for just one line, both from you, MD, and you, DG, that could be a soundbite that we take away with us. And I'm going to give you a little bit of help. I'm going to start the sentence with you, and I'm going to ask you to complete the sentence. And the sentence is like this: when we transition from informality, when we transition from informality, and you get to complete the soundbite, it cannot be too long because we got to keep it in a tweet and make sure that it is tweetable. So DG, you're an old hand at this now. I'm going to go to you first, DG. When we transition from informality, please complete the sentence.
We will have a better, more inclusive world of work.
When we transition from informality, we'll have a better, more inclusive world of work. I'll have to test it with our social media team, but I certainly think it sounds like a winner. MD, I'm going to close it off with you. When we transition from informality,
will be on the basis of our will to do so. It is possible. We have to muster the will to do it everywhere.
Thank you so much, MD. When we transition from informality, it will be on the basis of our will to do so. It is possible. I'm going to end the tweet there, and I'm going to say a massive thank you to the MD of the IMF as well as the DG of the ILO for really leaning into the conversation. Remember, you can visit our web event page to go and get a downloadable copy of the book that, of course, we launched here today, Global Informal Workforce, Priorities for Inclusive Growth. Now, if you sent us a question and we didn't get to that question, please do send more questions through the email, and the IMF and ILO teams will get back to you. The email is informaleconomy.org. Send us your questions and we will get back to you. From myself, Nozipho Shabalala from Johannesburg, South Africa, it's been an absolute pleasure to serve you today, and I hope that you have an incredible morning, day, or evening further. It's goodbye for now.